Good afternoon, everyone. As I've said previously, my name is Lisa Vanderwall, and it has been my honor to serve as one of the vice presidents over this last 8 years, and I now invite us all to be in this listening session of inputs. But let us begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we come before you this afternoon in the midst of a busy conversation, busy sessions, and busy minds. Please help us now to focus on how you would speak to us in this moment. And we ask that you will help us to be mindful of those around us, that in all things we might be your loving people. All this we pray through Christ our Lord. Amen. This afternoon, we will hear from 3 presenters as part of the continuation of the exploration of our theme. Our first speaker is Professor Nivedita Menon, who is a feminine scholar who has taught at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Is that close? JNU in Delhi since 2008. Before joining JNU, she taught for 15 years at Lady Shri Ram College and spent 7 years in the Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi. Menon has authored and edited books on feminism, contemporary politics, and political theory, including the 2004 volume Recovering Subversion, Feminist Politics Beyond the Law, Seeing Like a Feminist, and Secularism as Misdirection, Critical Thought from the Global South. She has also published in Indian and international journals and is one of the founders of the collective blog Kafila. She has translated works from Hindi and Malayalam into English, as well as from Malayalam into Hindi. With that, I invite her to speak.
Friends, I'm deeply honored to be among you today, and I would like to thank the World Communion of Reformed Churches for offering this kind of space for dialogue of a very different order than your usual business of the conference. So I'm deeply, deeply honored, and I'm very grateful to be given this opportunity to learn. I was here through the morning session, and I learned a lot. I would like to begin this talk on justice by reflecting on the 2 themes of your convention, Sumud and Shalom, steadfastness and peace, both such beautiful words made so tragic in our world today, but both deeply meaningful and direction-giving. Let me begin my discussion on justice with the idea of the photograph. We think of photographs as pieces of reality versus, for example, paintings, which we would see directly as an interpretation. But when you're asked, what does your baby look like? What does your sweetheart look like? What does your mother look like? You fish out a picture from your wallet if you're from my generation, or you fish out your phone and you show it, and then they say, oh, is this what your baby looks like? And you'd say, she looks exactly like this. But of course, a photograph is not exactly like the reality that it apparently represents, because it's flat, it's 2-dimensional, it's smaller in scale, etc. Why we see it exactly like reality, unlike a painting, which we would assume is the artist's interpretation, is because since the 19th century, we have come to learn how to read the codes of a photograph. So the work that this this little anecdote I'm relating, the work that it is doing is reminding us that the world and its truths are revealed to us through codes of representation that normalize and render the world legible and recognizable in specific ways. When we step outside these codes, other worlds are made visible. Justice requires us to question what has been normalized over time. Justice requires us to step outside the codes. So the first element of justice I'd like to think about is justice as order. Often what appears to be just is the normalizing of a previous history of violence, the passing on of disadvantage from generation to generation, just as for a handful of others, it's the passing of wealth and privilege from generation to generation. Not to recognize these histories of violence underlying normality is to legitimize a history of violence. Historian Pankaj Jha puts it this way: justice requires us to think like a historian. You don't stop at the now. Now has a history. But history is not just what happened in the past. History is what is happening. History is about the present. It's not because people want to remember what happened in the past that the past becomes important. The talk about the past is actually about wanting to talk about the present in a certain way and talk about the future in a certain way. That's why we have so many different interpretations and versions of what happened in the past. So when I say history of violence, I'm talking about the here and now, not something that is over and done with. The idea of something being just comes from a previous history of violence, one that continues. And at the end of it, because order prevails, it looks normal, natural even. The philosopher Romain Rolland said, if order is injustice, then disorder is the beginning of justice. So we need to think about social order more critically. In this context, let me tell you a story. I'm going to tell a lot of stories, I'm sorry. In this context, let me tell you a story about the Nicaraguan Sign Language, which, as many of you, or maybe all of you know, but I learned only very recently, which tells you something about the way in which knowledge and ignorance is produced by privilege, is that what I did not know was that sign language is not simply a signing of existing alphabets, but it's a language in itself. As I said, you all probably know this. But my not knowing it tells you something about how privilege works to occlude knowledge, to prevent knowledge. So Nicaragua, as again, most of you might know, is a country where a military dictatorship was overthrown in 1979. When that revolution took place, there was a huge push towards revolutionizing education. One of the things they decided to do was to start a proper an institution to teach sign language properly. It had been a very isolated society, so deaf people there had already developed their own language, which was unlike any other existing sign language in the world. It was called Nicaraguan Sign Language. After the revolution, they started building schools for deaf children to formally educate them. What was interesting, it was found, was that every year, as new students came in, they would pick up the language that the senior students were using and then break the rules. They would introduce new words and new ways of thinking and forming sentences, and it improved the language, it transformed the language, it made it much, much more supple and complex. Nicaraguan Sign Language is understood globally to be absolutely unique in that it is the only language ever to have been created without any other linguistic influences and recorded from its inception. What I learned when I read about this amazing story about the birth and growth of a relatively new language is that rule breaking, that is what would be called disorder, can be the foundation of new knowledge that reflects the hitherto invisible. And the reflection of the invisible, after all, is the path to justice. The other story I want to tell is by the French philosopher named Jacques Rancière, who wrote a book called The Ignorant Schoolmaster. In this book, Rancière tells the story of an actual teacher, Joseph Jacotot, who was sent to teach French to people in a Flemish-speaking area. They knew no French, and he knew no Flemish. The teacher had a bilingual translation of the Greek epic Iliad, which had French on one page and Flemish on the other. The teacher gave the children the text and told them to figure out the French words by comparing it with the Flemish section. And all the students learned French, in that sense, without being taught. That's why ignorant schoolmaster. Because, as Rancière puts it, they had their intelligence revealed to themselves. They figured it out on their own, between Flemish and French. Now, when I read this story as someone from a formerly colonized country whose languages were thoroughly marginalized, I question why Rancière, a liberal, enlightened philosopher, was not asking a simple question. Why was the teacher in a position where the Flemish children had to learn French, but he didn't have to learn Flemish? It was because of the way in which the French nation-state was created. All nation-states from the 18th century onwards have been created by marginalizing languages other than the dominant one and assimilating or destroying local cultures. French was the language of the French nation-state, and so Flemish, a minority language, had to be marginalized. Why was Rancière not even thinking about this? Because as a Frenchman, he saw this as progress. However, irrespective of the specific language, the idea of one nation, one language, or one nation, one anything, leads to injustice. In contrast to this model, consider another way of thinking about teaching as opposed to Rancière, the Brazilian scholar activist Paulo Freire, whose book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, again, many of you may be familiar with. Paulo Freire thought of pedagogy as follows. The teacher teaches the students 5 things, but the students teach the teacher 5 things. I draw from this pedagogic method the idea of the outside. If something is normal, and we've already problematized the word normal, if something is normal inside, when the outside breaks in, you think, oh, so it wasn't fixed and natural? What I'm calling the outside could be a teacher, could be a friend, could be a movement, could be someone who wants to impress you with a new way of thinking about the world, about God, or a book. The outside could be any one of these things. There is always an outside that stops power formations from being consolidated. Whether it is capitalism, patriarchy, supremacism based on a religious or racial or class identity, there is always an outside that breaks in. This is what Freire meant, that I think, that students are the outside of the teacher's knowledge and the teachers are the outside of the student's knowledge. When the outside bursts in, it destabilizes you. It makes you ask, oh, was I wrong all along? And sometimes it would be time to say, yes, I was wrong, but the new world that is revealed is terrible in its injustice, but wonderful in its possibilities for change. Is justice equality? So the first part was, is justice order? Is justice equality? The idea of justice as impartial sounds very fair, but I think we all would agree that it is not fair at all. Justice has to be based on the idea of recognizing differences and recognizing need. This has long, of course, been debated in philosophical circles, but it also rears its head whenever there is a contemporary debate on any kind of affirmative action. In India, that would be, for example, caste-based reservations or reserved seats on buses for women. The crux of the matter is the same. Should society recognize difference? Should justice be based on the idea of difference or not? Differences are of 2 kinds, hierarchy-based in difference, which is obviously unfair and unjust. For example, South Africa had a difference-based system, apartheid. But difference is not inherently hierarchical. Its social structures do produce hierarchy. Race, class, caste, and gender differences are also, they're differences, but they're also simultaneously hierarchical. Take gender. In the world in which we live, the gender we are assigned at birth determines our entire life and how we live it. This arises from the functioning of patriarchy, heteronormativity, the presentation of the world as containing only 2 sexes. But we now live in a world that has radically changed since the 20th century. We know that there are more than 2 genders. We almost take it for granted now. But when I grew up, I had to embrace that world and learn. Why? Because of a very powerful queer movement. We came to know these things because there was a pushback from society. And in order to live an ethical life, we cannot say, everything I know is correct. Rather, we have to say, everything I know may have to change, and it's changing every day. So the problem is not difference, but that difference is inserted into social circumstances that produce hierarchy. Take a physical disability like blindness. Why is blindness a disability? Because the world is built for sighted people. You would have heard the saying, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. But that is absolute and utter nonsense. The aphorism merely makes sense because this world is built for the sighted, and therefore it becomes difficult and problematic for the unsighted. Another small story. One of my friends worked in an office where one of his colleagues is blind. He dropped into his colleague's office around 4 p.m. on a winter evening in Delhi. By 5:30 p.m., it was already so dark that my sighted friend, couldn't see anything in the colleague's room. So he said to the blind friend, "Don't you want to switch on the light?" The friend laughed and said, "Well, if you really need it, you can switch it on." It was the sighted person who was left disabled by the darkness. The blind person was fine. Supposing we lived in a world which was structured for the blind, there would be no concessions for darkness, and we sighted ones would be the ones who would be stumbling into things, and disability would be of those who can see. Physical differences are disabilities only because society assumes a certain norm and builds around that norm. So my point is that justice has to be based on the idea of equitable treatment. Justice is not about sameness. Justice is about recognizing differences. And this is a debate that feminists and critical race theorists have had for a very long time. And it's from here that ideas of redistribution may be born. Justice as freedom. Is justice about freedom? Is there a difference? In English, there is, between freedom and liberty. Most Western philosophers do not make a distinction between the two, except for Hannah Arendt. Western liberal political, I'll come to Hannah Arendt in a second. Western liberal political theory has conventionally given liberty the highest value among liberal values, placing it above equality, above justice. Individual freedom began to be prized once the peasantry was thoroughly and violently dispossessed from the land over 16th to 18th centuries in Europe. One society was produced as consisting of a few property owners on the one hand and a vast mass of rightless, propertyless people on the other. Only after these transformations did individual liberty become a value espoused by Western philosophy. In Capital, many of you may know that Marx ironically uses the word free for those peasants who have been violently uprooted from the land and left with nothing but their labor power. They have nothing, but they have been freed of everything they possessed. The most well-known formulation in Western philosophy is that of Isaiah Berlin, who distinguished between negative liberty and positive liberty. Negative liberty as the absence of coercion by any external body, including the state. Positive liberty as the possibility of taking control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purposes. This is often attributed to collectivities rather than the individual. But Berlin and other liberals are suspicious of the positive concept of liberty because it carries the necessity of intervention by the state. For you to realize your full potential, certain social interventions have to be made. And the only institution that can do it in modern society is the state. But for most thinkers of the global south, whether African thinkers like Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, or Frantz Fanon, or in India, Gandhi and B.R. Ambedkar, the value was never expressed as liberty, but as freedom, defined in the context of anti-imperialism, and it was always conceived of as a community value. Freedom was never just freedom from colonial rule, but it was the freedom to build a new and just society. For Nyerere, the concept of Ujamaa, which can be translated as familyhood, was tied to communitarian values that would build a new socialist Tanzania. For Nkrumah, it was African socialism, built on our understanding of the communitarian basis of most pre-colonial societies and the absence of a tradition of private property. From this, he justified the existence of an indigenous African path to socialism, which he saw as offering a third way between Western capitalism and Soviet communism. For Frantz Fanon, freedom is social freedom, the freedom of the individual located in state and society, This involves consciousness of freedom, self-expression, and obedience to one's own self. This means that people themselves should make decisions which affect them. And when all people make decisions together, that is freedom. For this type of freedom to be realized, it is, of course, important that the nation-state be free from external control or from imperialism, but that internal to the nation-state, there should be ways in which people can continue to express dissenting views, and social and political arrangements should be such within the nation that there would be genuine justice. The human community must not only be a free state, but also a free society. Gandhi saw freedom as Swaraj, which is self-rule of the nation, but also of the person. But it was B.R. Ambedkar, one of, I think, the thinker of the 20th century and who shapes our thinking today in the 21st century. B.R. Ambedkar saw freedom as inextricably linked to a social revolution. Freedom meant the annihilation of caste, the title of his most famous book, and liberation from the oppressive caste order altogether. Nothing short of a social revolution. So for Ambedkar, political revolution alone would not bring about freedom or justice. A social revolution was required. And finally, about Hannah Arendt, the one Western philosopher who did make a distinction between liberty and freedom, Arendt understood liberty in the negative sense alone, that is freedom from oppression, but she saw that as very narrow. It can be enjoyed by the individual in private, even under a monarch or feudal hierarchy, she said. But freedom is broader, so that's liberty, but freedom is broader. Participation in public affairs, admission to the public realm. What Arendt is doing here is understanding freedom as countering the idea of historical inevitability. Freedom is the human capacity for action, creativity, spontaneity, and initiative against helplessly watching history enact itself. And now, can justice only perhaps be post-national? Here I want to point to the limitations of what sociologist and historian Sanjeev Barua calls the homelandist imagination, even among counter-nationalist movements. Barua makes an argument for an alternative institutional imagination than this homelandist one. This alternative imagination would disentangle identity from territorially and ethnically rooted collectivity. So he's writing this in the context of the northeast of India, but I think it has much broader validity. Because what it does is once we start rejecting the homelandist imagination, we are questioning national borders. If we want to bring about justice, we have to question national borders. We need to keep asking questions. What or who is the illegal migrant, after all? The migrant represents the phenomenon of movements of populations that had been widespread and common over the globe for hundreds of years. This movement could have been voluntary, seafaring traders, pastoral nomads, invading armies that ended up settling the lands they conquer. So it could be voluntary on that side, or it could be forced, slave trade, indentured labor to run plantations. Once the nation-state system was put firmly in place, however, such movement itself came under scrutiny from the new homelands. From this point onwards, approximately the early 20th century, migration began to be closely linked to the issue of the security of nation-states. I need to take a moment here to say that there are struggles for self-determination that are still valid. We are, after all, in the era of Gaza. So there are struggles for self-determination that are still valid, and anti-imperialism and anti-settler colonialism is something we do recognize and adopt. But the point is that to take the nation-state as the natural unit from which we can speak is something that we need to question. So from about the early 20th century, migration begins to be closely linked to the issue of security of nation-states. Ranabir Samadar points out that what is called migration is actually a continuation of natural human flows through the centuries, suddenly rendered illegal by new national borders. What now require to be called new rights, Samadar says, such as the right to move across national borders for trade, work, or for grazing of animals, for example, are not new privileges, but simply the re-legitimation of old practices, particularly when you think that over the last 3 decades, the movement of capital across nation-state borders has been completely naturalized. It's only the movement of labor that has been criminalized, of human beings that has been criminalized. Mahmoud Mamdani makes a startling claim contrary to nationalist wisdom that cultural communities rooted in a common past do not necessarily have a common future. Political communities, rather, should be defined not by a common past, but by the resolve to forge a common future under a single political roof. He believes, therefore, that citizens' rights should be attached to place of labor wherever they choose to work, not to the accident of place of birth. In short, we need to escape the homelandist imaginations that restrict our ethical horizons. It is the homelandist imagination that enables ethno-nationalisms like, in my country, the idea that India should be a Hindu nation, one in which communities that profess faiths other than Brahminical Hinduism, whether Islam, Christianity, or indigenous pre-Aryan faiths, are to be assimilated, marginalized, or exterminated. This is produced by the homelandist imagination. Any radical transformative politics today, therefore, must be post-national. In the way this term has been developed by a group of South Asian scholars, including myself, the post of post-nationalism is not to be understood in the sense of after, but in the sense of having passed through the nation. In this idea of post-national, the insistence on an uncompromising critique of the nation is the very obverse of the argument for post-nationalism, what I call post-nationalism from above, made from two opposed positions. One in which the sovereignty of the nation is sought to be bypassed in the interests of global capital, but also a Habermasian celebration of global universalism. Rather, the kind of post-nationalism I refer to is better described as being from below. Its politics can be represented by any idea that is counter-hegemonic, whether that hegemony refers to development, sexuality, caste, community, or any other. But equally importantly, it must be seen as having two dimensions. One, over the nation, across national borders, and two, under the nation, resisting inclusion into the so-called larger national identity, insisting on space-time trajectories that do not mesh with progressivist, dominant narratives of nation and history. The first dimension is, in a sense, easier to recognize as a subversive strategy, for it begins with the assumption of existing nations, which it then interrogates. So this can include cross-border solidarities of feminist movements, anti-nuclear and peace movements. In the recent, that is in the 2025 conflict between India and Pakistan, amidst a very charged atmosphere, a joint statement calling for peace was issued by over 1,000 feminists from both countries, at a time when to speak of peace was considered to be anti-national. It's still considered to be anti-national. The other dimension of post-national politics under the nation is less obvious as a strategy because it does not assume the prior existence of the nation. Its subversive edge may lie in the exact opposite of what animates the politics of over the nation, that is the strategy of exit and movement across borders. The interrogation of the nation from under may involve, for example, the refusal to move, as, for example, in the struggles against big dams or mining operations that involve massive relocation of populations. It can include the struggles of different groups for control over their natural resources being opened up to capitalist exploitation. This dimension may also involve claiming histories that run parallel to, that do not intersect with that of the nation at all. People may, I think, largely think of themselves as belonging to a locality. That is what they would call home, not necessarily an abstract nation state. For example, in the Indian state of Gujarat, after the massacre of Muslims in 2002, I met a woman called Zubaida in a relief camp. She had owned a small bangle business destroyed by the rioters. In the shade of the tree protecting the dargah, the shrine in the grounds of which the relief camp stood, she chatted to me about Delhi, where she has relatives. But she turned out not to be from Gujarat originally. She asked me in Hindi, "Bindravan gayi ho? Have you been to Vrindavan?" But she pronounced Vrindavan in a local way, not the Sanskritized way in which I'm saying it. Vrindavan is another state of India and is associated with the god Krishna's childhood. It's so related to Hinduism, in short, and is a very sacred spot of pilgrimage. She saw me as a Hindu, and so she asked me, "Have you not gone to Bindraban?" "No," I reply. She asked, "Tirath karne nahi gayi? You didn't even go there on pilgrimage." Then she says, "Hum wahi se hai, wahi hamara watan hai." We are from there. That is our land. Hamara watan, my land. Watan means one's homeland. But she didn't think of the nation state as home, nor of any Muslim pilgrimage site. For this Muslim woman, Zubaida, her watan was Vrindavan, the land of Krishna. She did not identify with any nation. She identified, like most ordinary people do, with a locality and its local culture while preserving her religious heritage. The post-national involves the recognition and valuing of these multiple histories and identities. Justice is anti-capitalist. I'm not even going to pose it as a question. Capitalism is unjust. It is violent. Violence is always involved in establishing capitalism, in enclosing commons, dispossessing people of their habitat. It's important to recognize in India that the Hindutva, so Hindutva is the term for political mobilization of the religion of Hinduism to produce an ethno-nationalism. So Hindutva is not the religion, Hindutva is the politics of exclusive and marginalizing ethno-nationalism. So it's important to recognize that the Hindutva-driven agenda, which wants to establish and is establishing a Hindu nation, it's also rapaciously capitalist. They're not unrelated. The two are related. So the attack on, for example, Christians in India, in areas where India's indigenous people live, Adivasis, they're called in central India, in their mineral-rich lands. So the attack on Christians in areas where India's indigenous people live in their mineral-rich lands is not only against a religious minority, it is against a religious minority, but it is not only against a religious minority, but because Christian priests and nuns stand with the Adivasis in their struggle against dispossession. Father Stan Swami is a name I would like to invoke at this point, who was arrested at the age of 84 as a terrorist for working with the Adivasis of central India. He was arrested and spent over a year in prison for terrorism. He died in jail at 84, a year or two ago. So this, we need to recognize, and Father Stan Swami was a reverend, he was a practicing Christian, but what he was arrested for was not for his Christianity, but for his working with indigenous peoples. Capitalism involves violence towards the environment. Capitalism encourages wars because the armaments industry is super wealthy and super powerful, and political elites all over the world are connected to it. The so-called ceasefire in Gaza at this time is entirely under the cloud of capitalism, because this illiberal peace, as scholars call the ending of armed conflict by authoritarian means, is headed towards establishing not a sovereign and self-determining Palestinian state, but an outpost for capitalist exploitation. Naomi Klein used the term disaster capitalism to indicate the way in which armed conflicts, natural disasters, and other forms of crises create an environment for political and economic elites to disempower and dispossess communities. Political control without democratic oversight allows these elites to capture and exploit reconstruction funds and provides them with opportunities for land grab and natural resources, and to privatize services. Gaza does risk, and we have to be realistic about this, becoming another example of disaster capitalism, following earlier instances in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon, among others. What can counter capitalism? Let's consider a few ideas. The idea of degrowth is something that has always interested me, an idea that formally emerged in Southern Europe in 2008, but with roots going back to the 1970s. Degrowth is a call for downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being, enhances ecological conditions, and equity on the planet. In other words, economic activity must not exceed the carrying capacity of the planet, and it should promote human well-being, not the avaricious pursuit of wealth. Obviously, this would have a specific meaning in the context of the global north, quite different from how it would play out in the global south. But we do need to remember that there are extremely poor people in the north and extremely wealthy people in the south. The importance of the idea of degrowth is that it delegitimizes. I've talked about naturalized ideas. It delegitimizes and denaturalizes the idea of endless growth, subscribed to in the south, not only by elites, but even by the left. The idea of degrowth is thus radically anti-systemic. Degrowth feminists have issued a statement calling for a recognition of care work as work, an end to the subalternization of reproduction in service to the realm of production. They say our economies are in the grips of the growth paradigm founded in heteropatriarchal capitalist principles and must be emancipated from it. The feminist degrowth response is one within an efflorescence of thinking about this core feminist idea about the value and marginalization of care work. Any attempt to deal with the ecological crisis only in centralized ways at the level of nation states is bound to fail. Equally important are the secession into decentralized but interconnected local ways of life, a replenishing of the commons, and absolute rejection of the idea of growth. Such a retreat might require state facilitation, at least for a start. That would not be a passive apolitical act, but rather a deeply political blowback against the continuing violence of corporate capital and state systems that sustain it. A second idea is rewilding, which is a specific ecological strategy, but I also want to use the term as a metaphor for the conscious political retreat from something called civilization, which is usually counterposed to something called wildness. Rewilding can be of many kinds, but I will simply talk about one particular way in which rewilding has been described by someone called Pradeep Kishan, who practices rewilding in India. Contesting the idea of compensatory afforestation, this is a very standard practice in India that green tribunal judgments are overruled by saying, oh, we can just destroy this forest and do compensatory afforestation somewhere else. We'll build this highway, we'll build these malls, and plant a forest somewhere else. So Pradeep Kishan asks this question, which I think is a very moving question about how we think about this earth. An old forest is a whole lot more than the sum of its trees. How do you recreate a community of plants, fungi, microbes, insects, and animals that are all part of a living jungle ecosystem? How many decades might it take? And how do you call into being a soil teeming with microorganisms and mycorrhiza that inhabit the humus that has taken 30,000 years to build up? Rewilding initiatives are happening in different parts of India. Some are initiated by middle-class people with an ecological vision and the cultural capital to embody it. But alongside these, we must take on board living practices of Adivasi and other indigenous peoples, both in India and globally, that preserve the biodiversity threatened and often destroyed by predatory capital in partnership with the state. A third idea linked to this is the idea of food sovereignty, a radical alternative to food security, which refers only to the availability of food. Food sovereignty, on the other hand, as defined by the Nileni Declaration of 2007, is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. Food sovereignty, land sovereignty, rewilding, and degrowth together create a tapestry of linked practices that could escape, even triumph over, capitalism's dreary concrete, like the little sapling which secures its roots in high-rise building walls, threatening to split them open as it pushes them deeper, or like weeds that spring up in the cracks of grey pavements. Feminist, Ambedkarite, post-national, and degrowth-oriented perspectives in the 21st century recognize uniformity as anti-democratic, the local as a legitimate space for assertion, imply a move to participatory forms of democracy, and call upon secular practices to recognize and legitimize religious identities in the public domain. With all the uncertainties that these shifts imply, for this uncertainty is still more ethical than the rigid certainties of the nation state. Justice then is not about one big revolution. It is a daily nibbling away at social norms, and suddenly the whole landscape has changed before you know it. Drawing on the inspiring and moving address of the president of the WCRC, let me recollect two phrases that she used. "We are a people under construction," she said in her lecture, And she also said, we practice our spirituality on the streets. As a feminist, a Marxist, and a votary of genuine participatory radical democracy, I belong to communities that practice our spirituality on the streets too. In the space that we inhabit in the future, I imagine a vibrant democracy, internally contested, locally rooted, recognizing heterogeneity, taking collective responsibility for ecological restoration and transformation, anti-capitalist and degrowth-oriented, committed to social justice and gender justice, always seeing democracy as a horizon, never to be reached, never to act as a closure, but keeping open the possibility of the emergence of unspecified futures, new identities, new notions, and sorry, I wanted to quickly wind up, new needs and new notions of justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nivedita. Appreciate your words. Our next speaker is Dr. Hannah Reichel. Am I saying that correctly? Yeah. Who is the Charles Hodge Professor of Systematic Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. Raised an ecumenical Lutheran, Rachel serves as a ruling elder in the PCUSA and on the Theology Working Group of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. Author of many works, including After Method and For Such a Time as This, their work has won academic honors, including the Lautenschlager Award for Theological Promise and the Ernst Wolf Award. It has also been featured in public outlets such as The Atlantic, the Presbyterian Foundation's Leading Theologically, CTI's Theology Matters, and Tripp Fuller's Homebrewed Christianity. Please welcome Rachel.
Professor Menon, thank you so much for your incredibly rich and thought-provoking input to us. You have given us so many concretions of struggles for justice, as well as epistemic pointers of how to think about its pursuit. I want to share a vignette from my own context on the notes of justice, order, and disorder that you've given us. The seminary at which I teach runs a small-scale sustainable agriculture project. It's called the Farminary. The Farminary teaches students about food and soil, about community and ecology, about rest and about labor, and its harvest services our cafeteria as well as the local community. At this Farminary, I teach a course entitled Theologies of Order and Chaos. Most of our existential experiences, personal, communal, and political, can be narrated as experiences of order and chaos. And the wager of this course is that so can our doctrines, right? So creation, providence, eschatology are narrations and conceptual frameworks developed to process experiences of order and chaos in light of the God we believe in. At the beginning of the course, students reflect on their associations with these concepts, order and chaos. Some students report traumatic life events, the inbreaking of a terminal illness, sexual violence, the death of a child. They often find that accounts of creation as the setting up of a stable and reliable order express their hope and faith in God best. Other students have experiences of suffering under systemic oppression due to their sexuality, gender expression, race, or ethnic background. Their hope and faith in God find themselves articulated more adequately in accounts of creation as an outburst and overflowing of energy that opens up new possibilities. And then one year, just before the first day of class, a hurricane devastated the Forminaries Gardens. The class had just been getting ready to harvest a rich summer's harvest, and instead we found ourselves doing the grief work of composting what was now contaminated due to flood water overflowing from nearby sewers. That year's class had a whole different take on order and chaos than the courses of other years, I can tell you, formed by the storm. We need a differential theology to do justice to our different experiences of the world, of grace, and our need for deliverance. And we also need different accounts of justice. Neither God nor justice are merely corrective projections of our experience. But neither God nor justice can be formulated without indexing them to our differential experience. Injustice comes in many different forms, we know this. And maybe that means also that there cannot be a singular form of justice. I take it that the reluctance to formulate positive visions of freedom and justice that you hinted at, that this reluctance only partially has to do with the difficulty of coming up with such a positive notion. That at a deeper level, such reluctance draws an ethical boundary, expressing the wisdom that any singular positive articulation of justice won't be able to do justice, pardon the pun, to the multifaceted and multi-layered realities of injustice, but just become another harmful and oppressive system. This is why I so strongly resonate with your proposal that justice must be post-national, not in a glib cosmopolitan sense, but in this twofold, not one, but twofold outsidism, right? Going both over and under that false universalism promised by the nation. Justice is, as you so wonderfully gesture toward in many concretions, neither an abstract global order, nor a homelandist claim to purity and authenticity that is all local. Justice is always local and therefore also differential. Sometimes it means allowing movement. Sometimes it means refusing to move. We need that discernment. This doesn't mean that it's relative or arbitrary. It means that it is concrete and locally sourced and boundary crossing and communally discerned and material and therefore differential if it is to be at all. And that for its concrete outside to show itself, we do well to attune to both what goes over and under any base category of our political economy at the same time. Justice is not an abstraction. It is only ever concrete. But it is an aspirational category. By that, I don't mean that it is imaginary, but that we formulate our need and desire for justice correctively. In light of concrete forms of injustice that we know, we formulate hunches for what anything deserving of the name justice would have to look like. But if this is true, then the cry for justice, whether articulated as order or equity or freedom, that cry for justice then functions less like a blueprint or a roadmap to a new and right order, and more like the disruption of both the order and disorder that we know. Justice then points to an outside, even as it, as you so insightfully show, tends to also come to us from an outside of what we are capable of telling ourselves, outside of what we can imagine, and to some extent, outside of what we may bring about. There's something deeply theological and eschatological in this vision that both invites perseverance and creativity, even as it points us outside of ourselves. There is always, you say, there is always an outside that stops power formations from being consolidated. Queer, crip, feminist, and decolonial scholars turn this outside into a critical epistemology, insight from the margins. To paraphrase Sarah Ahmed, those who are not quite at home in a body, a nation, or a built environment, those who are not quite at home have much to teach us about the way things are built. Christians also call on such outside for insight and discernment and confession and witness. Around 75 years ago, the First Assembly of the World Council of Churches met in Amsterdam under the motto, "Man's disorder and God's design." I see someone nodding. Were you there? No. Man's disorder and God's design. So devastated by war and genocide, disillusioned by the complicity of nationhood, law, technology, and morality in the atrocities, people at this First Assembly of the World Council of Churches wrote the world up to a state of disorder in good Augustinian fashion, disordered by universal sin that manifests socially and politically as well. And they sought to reorient themselves, trying to discern, and these were the 4 parts of their program, the universal church in God's design, the church's witness to God's design, the church and the disorder of society, and the church and their international disorder. These are, of course, very laudable attempts at theological and ethical and political reorientation, and they issued into so many important ecumenical and international instances of institution building and community building and work towards peace and justice. But if I'm honest, today I find scarier than any attempt to design the right order only the invocation of God as the guarantor of such design. At best, this might be a form of corrective projectionism. At worst, yet another iteration of Christian supremacy. Maybe today we have a greater appreciation for the fact that order is not outside of universal sin any more than disorder, and that Christian theology itself is deeply entangled in sin too. Neither a concept of order nor Christianity provide the needed outside. Both order and disorder stand under the judgment of the concrete and material suffering they engender, as does Christian theology and praxis. Persevering in our witness today in great part means the confession of Christianity's complicity and sin. Thankfully, God is not the guarantor of order. The God we believe in does not offer the blueprints for the right design. God is the necessary breaking up of both our order and disorder to open up new possibilities, and God provides the critical epistemology to intervene in both. Today, persevering in our witness might mean, then, to welcome the Spirit's ability to disrupt our systems and reorient our desires. Persevering in our witness might mean to insist in God's judgment over both our order and disorder. Persevering in our witness might mean to look for Christ's concrete incarnational solidarity across boundary as well as under the levels of the nation state, the family, and even the church. Thus, perseverance opens up epistemic humility, the need to seek out for our discernment, confession, and witness those insights from the outside, from the margins of church and society, from queer, feminist, and decolonial epistemologies, but also from outside of the church, as they come to us from other faiths, indigenous traditions, ecological wisdom. Persevering in our witness might mean then to insist on the work of justice as neither purely negative nor positive, but as participation in contestation and discernment, deliberation, and transformation. For all the insights and inspirations that you've given us towards this goal, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah, for that presentation. Appreciate it very much. And now we will hear from Right Reverend Dr. Colin Cowan, a prominent theologian and ecumenical figure, is moderator for the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. Reverend Cowan served as minister of the Savannah United Church from 1998 to 2002. He is the previous General Secretary of the Council for World Mission and has served on the Executive Committee of the World Alliance of Reformed Church. Let us welcome Reverend Colin Cowan.
Thank you, Moderator, President, General Secretary, sisters and brothers of the ecumenical community. It's a delight to be in this space with you once again. My contribution to this lecture is to talk about disordering orders, embodying justice as a response to this very provocative and profound presentation by Professor Menon. I want to begin by expressing my profound gratitude to you, Professor Menon, for the presentation we have just heard. It has provided a rich, challenging, and necessary framework for thinking about justice, not as a static destination, but as a dynamic and disruptive process. It is a challenging message, one that echoes through both scripture and social reality, demanding that we unlearn much of what we have been taught to regard as sacred, natural, and inevitable. From a Christian standpoint, the invitation to disorder is not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. Rather, it is a participation in God's redemptive work, the divine pattern of bringing new life out of chaos. In Genesis, God does not create from neatness and symmetry, but from formlessness and void. The incarnation of Christ itself represents a divine interruption of human order. The Word made flesh, born among the poor, unsettling religious and political systems that thrived on hierarchy and exclusion. Thus, to disrupt order in the pursuit of justice is to act in the spirit of the God who makes all things new, according to Revelation 21. Appreciating that Professor Menon speaks from a feminist perspective, I acknowledge and accept her powerful, though provocative, proposition that patriarchy, from which I benefit as a man, must be one of those orders to be disordered. This is my starting point. I confess that this is a necessary and uncomfortable starting point, and it frames my own engagement not as an ally who stands outside, but as a beneficiary who must work from within to dismantle the very structure that privileges me. To unlearn patriarchal privilege is an act of repentance, of turning away from control and entitlement towards humility and partnership. Building upon the foundation laid out, I would like to emphasize two other orders from the presentation that resonate deeply, and then I will add a third for our collective consideration. First, the order of international immigration policies and practices. The presentation poignantly deconstructed the homelandist imagination and reframed migration as a natural human flow, suddenly, perhaps more methodically or intentionally rendered illegal by the arbitrary lines of nation states. Following thinkers like Samanda and Mandani, we are pushed to see the migrant not as a threat to security, but as a living critique of the violent exclusionary order of the nation state itself. The call for a post-national politics from below is in essence a call to disorder this border regime, to re-legitimize the right to movement and to attach rights to labor and presence, not to the accident of birth. Thus, this is a fundamental disorder required for any contemporary conception of global justice. I am pleased that I was able to enter this country without the need for a non-immigrant visa, a reminder that this is in fact possible. But I am the recipient of countless unnecessary and expensive demands to secure visa for my legitimate visit to nation states, and even having to suffer the indignity of being escorted to the aircraft from which I alighted in Bangladesh, having applied for the entry visa and was told, despite my insistence, that there was only visa on arrival available to Jamaicans. Yes, my passport was confiscated and handed over to the aircraft attendants while I shamefully re-entered the aircraft from which I earlier alighted, with all eyes on me for a crime of entering a sacred border. This is the plight of the two-thirds world, the global south. And there are endless numbers of situations that you and I know of stateless people and the challenges of migration and border concerns. Second, I want to emphasize the deordering of ability as a social category through the lens of liminality. The story of the blind colleague and the sighted visitor was not merely an anecdote about perspective. It was a radical epistemological shift. It illustrated that disability is not an inherent personal tragedy, but a social relation produced by a world built for a specific assumed norm. This framing positions liminality, the state of being betwixt and between established categories, not as a rare exception affecting minority, but as a fundamental factor of the human condition. We are all, at various points, the outside that stumbles in the dark, disabled by an environment not designed for us. And yes, I speak personally again. When I visited the Caribbean Christian Center for the Deaf in my country, I became acutely aware that those categorized as disabled were all communicating with one another. I was unable to join the conversation because of my inability or disability. I suggest that recognizing this should universalize the need for a justice that is designed for diversity and difference, not for the mythical sameness. It disorders the very idea of a normal body and mind. Theologically, this insight echoes Paul's image of the body in 1 Corinthians 12. The part of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. Justice then cannot mean sameness. It must mean equity, the recognition and accommodation of difference as essential to the whole. This brings me to the third order I wish to place on the table for disordering. The philanthropic industrial complex of reparation. The presentation's historical lens is crucial here. If, as we heard, justice requires us to think like a historian and recognize that the now has a history of violence, then our response to that history must be equally scrutinized. Drawing from feminist reflections on justice from the global south, particularly the work of scholars like Menon herself, I argue that true reparation must be understood as relinquishment, not as a mission program or project to be designed, managed, and controlled by donor agencies, be they church or parachurch organizations, civil society, or governments, who not only design the program, but determine its scope, language, and the beneficiaries. The current model of development and reparation often replicates the very colonial and patriarchal power dynamics it claims to remedy. It positions the global north or elite national institutions as the benevolent architects of justice, the holders of knowledge on how to fix the problems of the marginalized. This is a form of epistemic violence. It designs projects, controls budgets, sets benchmarks, and demands accountability to the donor, not to the community seeking justice. It is, in effect, a new mission civilisatoris, a program of ordering the disordered according to the pre-approved manageable blueprint. A feminist understanding of justice as relinquishment calls for a different path. It demands that those who have historically benefited from the orders of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism, be they states, corporations, or individuals like myself, must actively relinquish power, capital, and control. This is not about designing a better program for others. It is about ceding the very right to design. It is about repatriating land, redistributing wealth unconditionally, and transferring decision-making power directly into the hands of those who have been dispossessed. This is the ultimate disorder for the humanitarian and development sector. It means the end of their raison d'etre as managers of poverty and injustice. It is a justice that is not administered but embodied, not transaction but transformation of power relations. It aligns with the degrowth and food sovereignty principles mentioned, which prioritize self-determination and local control over corporate and state-dominated systems. In conclusion, I received this presentation from Professor Menon as both indictment and invitation. A reminder that God's justice will not be tamed by our comfort. To follow Christ is to embrace this order when order sustains oppression, to abandon control so that grace may reorder creation. Our speaker has gifted us with a vision of justice as a daily nibbling disorder. To that I add that this nibbling must be directed not only at the visible structures of patriarchy, borders, and ableism, but also at the insidious architectures of saviorism that too often masquerade as solutions. The path to justice is paved not by better managers of the old orders, but by their active and courageous dismantling through the relinquishment of power to the multiple, vibrant, and self-determining outsides that are already forging a just future. If the church, if WCRC dares to walk this path, we may yet glimpse the kingdom, not as distant perfection, but as ever emerging borderless communion of the free and the forgiven. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for listening to me. God bless you.
A deep and sincere gratitude to the three of you for your presentations, and they give us a lot of food for thought for looking at our justice work as we go forward. We are trying to catch up a little bit on time, so we are not offering time for questions for clarification, but I would like a motion with a card to refer these to the discernment groups, if I might. Seeing one in the back and several, will you all please hold up your cards that is your desire? Okay, those will go to our discernment groups. And now I would like to call on our General Secretary, Interim General Secretary Setri, to please give us some marching orders for going forward. Thank you.
I also do want, on behalf of the Communion, to say thank you for that inspiring presentation. So this is one of those impossible times that has arrived. We'll take a quick tea break. It simply means taking the tea and coming right back, because we are about half an hour behind time. We should be ending the tea break at this time. So if we can covenant to come back around 3:45 or 3:45, then we will start the next session. It will be slightly shorter than programmed, because we do want to spend enough time in the discernment groups after that. So please take the tea quickly and come back. In the next session, please get your earphones. That's very important. And for those who need the handbook in other languages other than English, you'll find them near the where we take the tea break. Please pick a copy. If you are not Spanish, French, or German, or Korean, or Indonesian, don't speak any of those. There are limited copies for only those who need them. Thank you.